been asked to say a little bit about my experiences of stepping up to what some people call high stakes action or high impact action, high risk action. And I'll just be talking for about 10-15 minutes just about my own experiences and what motivates me, just in case it's helpful for anyone here. And I just, before I start, wanted to honour the tree protectors currently at the camps up and down the route for HS2 who are showing us the way, really, with their fortitude and their courage and their camaraderie. Very, very inspiring for the rest of us. And also wanting to honour the earth protectors around the world who are protecting forests and rivers and ecosystems for all of us. We all depend on this planet's ecosystems. So wanting to honour them, and in particular that they are sacrificing so much. According to Global Witness, I think last year 300 or more earth protectors lost their lives, murdered by governments and corporations because of their efforts to protect this earth. So a bit about me. I'm a musician by profession, and I'm a mother of 2 daughters. And before XR came along, I was a completely law-abiding citizen. And I considered myself an environmentalist really since I was a teenager, young teenager. So I did what I thought was right. So I had, a particular lifestyle that I thought was a green lifestyle. And I also was involved in various organizations, environmental organizations, giving them money, working for one of them at one point. And I did the usual stuff that we've all done, like signing petitions, going on marches. I wrote to my MP loads, getting involved in sort of local things. So doing everything I thought was right. And really then about 10 years ago, becoming aware that not only was actually none of this really having any significant effect, but actually things were looking like they were getting a whole lot worse. And a sort of growing sense of sort of horror, really, at what was coming down the track. And then XR came along, and I joined up straight away as soon as I heard about it, with a huge sense of relief. And I think XR taught me 4 really important things, which I'm only going to just touch on because I haven't got very long. But very briefly, the 4 things were, firstly, the truth of the science and the kind of scientific facts about climate and nature breakdown, and the fact that we're possibly or even likely facing near-term societal collapse. And the second thing I learnt was how these issues of sort of climate and ecosystems actually link in completely with wider issues of social justice. So inequality, racism, exploitation, how it totally interconnected it all is. And the third thing was, this is Roger's speciality, of course, the theory of change, and the kind of inconvenient truth, to me at least, that actually non-violent direct action and disruptive non-violent direct action is essential to achieving any kind of major systemic change. And then the fourth thing I learned was a really important part of XR, particularly at the beginning. I think we've kind of maybe lost our way with it a bit, but this idea of regenerative culture. And as you can say a lot about what that actually means, for me, it's about really grounding ourselves and discovering our resilience and resourcing ourselves through being grounded in that sense of interconnectedness. So we're not just here alone, but we're connected to every other human and every other being, and the earth and future beings as well. So learning those 4 things really helped me step up and get involved with XR, nonviolent direct action. And I've been involved in quite a few things over the last couple of years. And in particular, I was one of the 3 people who did the DLR action at Canary Wharf, where we stood on top of a DLR train with a banner and glued onto the train. And I spent a week in prison on remand for that. And I was also involved in the Treasury fire engine action, where we sprayed fake blood over the front of the Treasury from a fire engine, in order to draw attention to the Treasury's continuing funding of fossil fuel projects around the world. And then I've also most recently, I disobeyed in the dock when I went to court in November, was sent to prison for a week for contempt of court. So, oh, Roger's just entered the waiting room. Oh gosh. So all of these actions, I would say, are quite, I found them quite challenging, felt quite risky, definitely way outside my comfort zone. But I'm very happy to do these actions. I'm very happy to use what I consider to be my good fortune and my privileges to do these things. And as somebody put it, I'm happy to repeatedly throw myself onto the wheels of the machine. And the reason I'm happy to do these things is, well, to sum it up really, is the alternative is not to act, not to do these things. That's the alternative. And given where we are, that's just an unbearable prospect. As a mother, I just can't not do these things. So why do I step up? Why do I feel I can step up and do these higher stakes actions? And in particular, why have I signed up to the action that we're going to find out about later? I'm just going to go through very briefly some of the things, because there's a whole raft actually of reasons why I'm kind of motivated to get involved, and maybe some of these might resonate with you. So the first thing is, I think I feel like I have a moral duty to do these things. I'm not going to really say very much at all. It's almost like I'm going to list them. If people got questions about any of this, I'll take questions afterwards, but just a list for now. So a sense of moral duty. There's also this, I feel like the need to make a visible sacrifice in order to wake people up. There are still a lot of people that haven't fully grasped what's happening, the situation we're in. So this kind of really visible sacrifice, I think, really helps kind of wake people up a bit. There is a feeling for me about redemption, an opportunity to perhaps be my highest self, or make up for past failures. There is definitely that sense. Then there's a very strong feeling for me about being a worthy ancestor, and also, in fact, worthy of my forebears, who I recognise made so many sacrifices in order that I can lead a peaceful and comfortable life. So to be a worthy descendant of those forebears, and a worthy ancestor to my children and my children's children, if my children have children. In any case, to be able to kind of look my daughters in the eye and say I did what I could. It's very important to me. And then the final, well, penultimate actually reason is, for me, there's a real sense of being alive. To at this time, being alive means stepping up. So it's a bit like the mother warthog in the savannah with her babies, and maybe a lion or a leopard is coming along and going to attack. And the mother warthog will, of course, protect her young, even though the odds are stacked against her and it's a very dangerous situation. Of course she will do that, unless she's dead, or unless she's drugged or mortally wounded. Of course she's going to step up. That is what being alive means. So that's a very powerful reason for me to step up at this time. But I think there's just one more thing that's really important, because all of these reasons that I've mentioned so far, it all makes it sound very, very risky, very dangerous, very painful, sacrificial. Yeah, all of those kind of things. And of course it is, not to deny that. But there's definitely more to it than that. And I think it's really important just to touch on that before I finish, because just thinking about the sort of danger and the fear and all the rest of it will lead us into feelings of fear, yeah, sure, and maybe terror, yes. And that's kind of natural and certainly what I feel. But the thing is, if those feelings are not supported or managed in a good way, they can really easily lead into sort of behaviours like we sometimes see. So people like avoidance and maybe shutting down completely, turning away, shooting the messenger, or projecting onto people, communicating an inconvenient message. And those sorts of behaviours indicate that we've kind of lost our power and we've lost our resilience and our resourcefulness. So I think to enable us here to really step up and be part of these kind of necessary high stakes actions, there has to be a bit more to it. And luckily there is. And it's kind of going back to this wider sense of self and the sort of regenerative culture thing that I mentioned at the start. Because we're not doing these actions alone. It's not just us acting as a solitary individual. We're doing this together. We're doing it with other people. And there is this sense of being part of something bigger than just our individual selves. And it's incredibly powerful. And we've all probably done actions, and you know what I mean. You get that feeling of such connection, not just with the other people in the action, but with everybody in the world, with everything in the world, with life, with the universe. It's really, really powerful stuff. It's very beautiful. It's very magical. So we can actually do these actions with a sense of almost joyfulness, because we're not alone. We're doing this together, and it's almost as if the life force is coming through us, if that's not too woo-woo. So I think we just need to tap into that and remember that, and it's incredibly empowering, and it's the truth as well. It's like that is what happens. So I just want to finish really by saying we need to remember that. That's a very important part of what we're doing. It's not all about risk and danger and fear. And I think these things also come through in the action itself. It's very important. So if it's just about fear and terror and risk, that will be apparent in the action, and it becomes about kind of them and us, and, you know, distancing ourselves and, you know, fighting against an enemy and stuff like that. And it really isn't about that. And I think if we act with this kind of sense of love and connection, that will be very, very apparent in the action itself, and it will be apparent to the world, and the world will be watching and will pick up on that. So I think it's really important for the action as a whole, as well as ourselves as just ordinary humans trying to do our bit. So I think that's probably enough from me. There'll be a chance for questions after Roger's spoken. Roger's here, so
thanks very much everyone for coming along. And I'm going to do a talk, and then we'll take some questions, and then we'll split up into two groups in terms of who might want to do what, when, and where, and then there's a process through which people can go if they want to take things further. So obviously, I'm pretty sure many of you have got lots of experience of being an XR and don't want to be told how to suck eggs, but I'm going to repeat a few things that maybe we already know, but it's always useful, I think, to be reminded of what we're already supposed to know in this business, because it's so easy to get distracted by the small things of life and the bureaucracies and the pettiness and what have you, and not actually focus on our responsibilities at this time, which is the name of this talk. And I want to try and make as crystal clear as I can that the situation we face is of extreme severity, and also that what we have to do about it is actually also extremely clear. It's not complicated, dare I say it. It's very emotionally difficult, but it's not complicated. And those are two separate things. So I'm going to start off just by talking a little bit about Nick Stern, who some of you may know. He's a very eminent professor at the London School of Economics, and I used to go and see him when I was at King's College, and he actually did a lecture, I think it was around 10 years ago now, more around the Copenhagen conference or close after it. And I always remember, you know how you remember these little phrases from talks, and I always remember him saying that climate change basically means World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression rolled into one. And he said that in 2009, so God knows what it means now. But so I'm going to start off by just reading you a quote from World War I. I think it's quite interesting for a number of reasons, but also to sort of set the scene. If everyone can mute, by the way, that would be great. So this is really setting the scene of what we're looking at in terms of the actual thing that's coming down the line. All right, so this is about the Battle of Passchendaele. So the quote from this history is as follows: "The goal was yet another fantasy of General Haig's, a plan to break out of Antwerp and capture the Channel ports of Belgium. For the British soldiers, it was the worst battle of the war. The ground was flat, sodden, shattered by shellfire. On the first night of the assault, the last day of July, the rains began, and after a brief respite in September, did not cease until November. 3,000 British guns fired more than 4 million explosive shells, nearly 5 tons of high explosive for every yard of German trench. The result was a muddy quagmire, a sea of black waste and shell holes, carcasses of horses and men, rats the size of cats, clouds of yellow and brown mist, the unbearable stench of rot and gangrene, the sweet smell of violets, which was the smell of gas and thus the odour of death. To slip off wounded off a duckboard was to drown in fathomless morass. Gunners worked knee-thigh deep in water. To advance over open ground, soldiers used the bodies of the dead as stepping stones. On the day of the final assault, a British senior officer close to General Haig, Lieutenant Sir Lancelot Giggle, made his first ever visit to the front. Reaching as far as his car could advance, appalled by the conditions, he began to weep. "Good God," he said, "did we really send men to fight in that?" The man beside him, who had been in action, replied flatly, "It's much worse further up." So what I want to say is, I'm sure for all of us here tonight, no one can quite grasp the absolute horror and terror of what war means. And what we've heard is an example of what we're sending the next generation into, according to Nick Stern. And what I want to suggest is, to the extent that we can understand it and feel that horror and terror, I want to suggest that that is the most important thing we have, which is our emotional abhorrence of what is coming down the line, because it's that emotion that is going to drive us to avoiding the extinction events that are coming down the line. So that's what we want to hold on to tonight, is that basic feeling of obscenity of what we're dealing with this government and with the carbon economy. That's the reality of it. But also, I want to suggest that this quote is really an analogy of what is happening today. That most of the population, the vast majority of the population, and certainly for the people that are in charge of this death project, they're like General Haig. They never have the guts to go to the front. And today, people don't have the guts to actually look into the reality of what is actually going to happen to people. And I'd like to suggest that XR, and the majority of people in XR, are like the lieutenant. They've driven up to the front, they've peered into the morass, but they haven't gone further up. They haven't gone into the actuality of what that horror is. They've stepped back. So what I want to do in this talk is to suggest that we have an absolute responsibility to go further up. That's what I want to challenge you all to do, and to challenge myself. And what I think it's important to do is to establish that there's been significant changes in what we know about the horrors to come since Extinction Rebellion was set up in 2018. We're in 2021. 3 years is a long time in the climate emergency. In 2020, it was 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial. The days of 1 degree have gone. We're at 1.3. Between 2000 and 2010, the temperature went up by 0.2. Between 2010 and 2020 by 0.3. So the basic maths, the bottom line situation is that 1.3, and in the next 10 years, we're going to go over 1.5 to 1.6. That's effectively locked in. That's what we know. That's what the establishment knows, and that's what the scientists know. We also know, which we didn't know in 2018, is that the Arctic ice is going to melt regardless of how much we reduce carbon emissions in peer-reviewed papers that came out this year. And the point at which the Arctic is going to melt is at some point between 2030 and 2035. So it's already locked in. It's not like we're waiting for these triggers to happen. That one's locked in. Another trigger that's locked in is the Greenland Ice Cap Sheet. Again, the peer-reviewed papers this year, in the last 3 months, have confirmed that the Greenland ice sheet is going to melt even if we reduce carbon emissions to 0. In other words, 7 meters of sea level rise is now locked in over the next 50, 100, 200 years. We're not sure. But what we do know for sure is every town and city in the world on the coast is going to have to be evacuated. That's like an act of vandalism beyond their imagination. That's what we've allowed to happen over the last 10 years. And what I want to communicate, in case we forget this, is that the establishment, the people who know what should happen, know this reality, right? I talked to the head of an Australian think tank like 2 or 3 weeks ago, well, about 2 months ago now, and he had a chat to a top member of the British establishment, right? This person, you know who he is, he's on the telly, he's been famous for 20 years. He said to the top of this think tank in Australia, he didn't want this guy to share his name. He said, we have 1 year to convince the public that we need to stop the Arctic from melting, and we have 1 year to do geoengineering to make it stop. That's what he said. But he hasn't said that in public. That's the level of cowardice and betrayal that we're facing in terms of the people that are running this country. Okay, so we've also had the Bank of England announcement today. Has anyone seen it? So the Bank of England has commissioned a report. It's just come out today saying we're heading for catastrophe. We're heading for catastrophe because of biological collapse, right? So again, what we need to understand is what that means. What that means is social collapse. And what social collapse means is mass rape, mass slaughter, and mass starvation. That's the actuality of it. And I talked to a professor, he's a sort of professor, I can't remember what his title was, at Harvard University. And again, I talk to all these people, which is why I'm mad as hell, right? Because they sort of tell you to your face what's going on. And he said, like, basically nothing's going to save us apart from geoengineering, right? And he's got a plan to cover the whole of the Sahara and the whole of India with like mirrors. And he says that's the only thing that's going to happen. You know, he's professor of physics or whatever. He says you can't suck the stuff out, right? He says it's against the law of physics to be able to suck the carbon out. But we can do mirrors, but we've got to cover all that area just to keep the temperature the same. So we've got this small window to do it. And he said in 10 years, it's going to be too late. Because he used the analogy of a jar of marbles, right? It's easy to throw them on the floor. It's impossible to put them back. So this is the extremity of the urgency of the situation, right? It's not a linear thing. Once the ice has melted, it's a massive, massive amount of energy to get the Arctic to melt again, even if we could, which is questionable. So the first thing I'm trying to communicate here is 2021 is the absolute point of necessity to do whatever is necessary to create the transformation that we have, right? This is nothing about creating a cozy social movement. It never was. But even if it was, that's not where we're at today. And that's why I'm doing this talk with you. And I want to say something about myself and why it's really clear to me personally, because of some experiences in my life. When I was 18, I went to India and I worked for a civil rights movement in 1985, I think it was. And when I got there, around 20 workers were shot dead by the police in a textile strike. And the police went into the villages of the workers and raped the women, the wives of those workers. And that changed my life. I never quite recovered from it, because what it did was it showed me in close up what social conflict looks like. And I got a scholarship to the London School of Economics. I was quite brainy, as you may know, and I left. And I spent 20, 30 years doing manual work because I didn't want to participate in a system of such systematic cruelty. And I became an organic farmer, and in 2006, it rained for 7 weeks. The highest level rain for 1,000 years in Wales in the summer. After 4 weeks, 500,000 plants in my fields were dead. That year, I didn't produce one single outdoor vegetable. And I went round those fields and looked at those thousands and thousands of rotting plants. And that's what made me realize we're heading for mass starvation. Because if it gets that bad so soon, we know what's coming, which hundreds of millions of farmers know, which is it's going to get to the tipping point where there's going to be mass food shortages, which is going to make COVID look like a holiday, right? That's what's coming down the line. So we sort of know this because, if you weren't aware, we're putting carbon into the atmosphere, according to peer-reviewed papers, 20 to 30 times faster than the Great Dying of 35 and 50 million years ago, right? I think that's the most terrifying statistic I've ever come across. Because the more you think about it, it's like you're not just kicking the wall softly down the hill. You're belting it at 20 to 30 times faster than the last time the Earth collapsed into a mass dying, killing 90 to 95% of life on Earth. That's the absolute extremity of what's going on. Okay, so the first thing then is just to remind ourselves, because I'm sure you're all aware of this, is the situation is beyond fucked, right? We've known that for a while, and we're at that point of absolute necessity in 2021. Now, what I helped to set up Extinction Rebellion to do was to engage in civil resistance against the British government. Not because I've got a big thing about civil resistance, not because I'm super radical, but because it works and it's necessary. And that's really what Extinction Rebellion pays me to do, right? I'm a scholar first and foremost. And what you pay me to do, in so much as I used to get paid, is to work the figures out, right? So I'm here to tell you the figures and how it works. And what I'm here to tell you is it is entirely possible, right? It is entirely possible to create the legislative change in order to put ourselves into the ballpark of winning, right? Of minimizing the tragedy that's coming down the line. And the reason we haven't is because we're not doing it, right? As simple as that, right? We need to do what is necessary. And what I want to suggest is there's two motivations in order to do what's necessary. There's doing what's necessary because it's the right thing to do, because it's the moral thing to do. And the second reason to do what's necessary is because it strategically makes sense. If you do this, it works. Now, both of those are important. I'd like to suggest the most important one is the morality. That unless you have your moral ducks in a row, you're not going to be able to understand how to strategically work through what needs to be done. And what I want to suggest is that at this point in 2021, the moral imperative for anyone who has a semblance of concern about what's coming down the line is to enter into civil resistance, and civil resistance results in imprisonment. That's what civil resistance does. So what I'm trying to say here is that when going to prison is not a tactic, right? It's not an option. It's a consequence, okay? It's a consequence of the material disruption that people engage with when their governments are engaged in radical evil. So going to prison is basically what the government does to you. It's an end product. And the reason they put you into prison is to stop you doing material disruption, because they can't afford to have you to continue. So this is what I call like the material nature of resistance. So what I want to try and say on this is it's very similar to a labour strike. So you may have known, I've used this analogy before, right? The reason labour strikes work, and they don't always work, but everyone knows they work more often than not, is because of the materiality of the struggle. In other words, it doesn't matter what the bosses think of you. You're not persuading the employer to come to the table. You're forcing the employer to come to the table because he's losing money. The accountants come in and say, you're losing too much money, you've got to negotiate. And the reason it's a material thing is because you're not working, right? That's how it works. It's not a protest. It's not an act of persuasion. It's not a virtue signal. It's saying, if you don't give us a pay increase, we're not working for you and you'll lose loads of money. And what civil resistance is saying to a government is, if you don't act morally, then we'll close down the country and we'll force you to put us in prison. That's completely different to symbolic protest, right? It's completely different to the traditions of, you know, demonstrations and all the rest of it. And don't get me wrong here, right? People often get this wrong. This isn't an ideological point, okay? I haven't got a problem with demonstrations. I haven't got a problem with emailing. I'm saying it's not appropriate morally when a government is acting in such an extreme genocidal fashion. Okay, so the other thing is, which is important from a moral point of view, is the more you know, the more you're morally obliged to enter into resistance when a government is engaged in radical evil. In other words, like if you're passing a house down your road where children are being raped and where child abuse is happening, you can't go back in time. You know. And if you know, you're complicit. If someone doesn't know that there's a house where child abuse is happening, then they're not complicit. But if you know, if you've been to a Heading for Extinction talk, if you listen to this talk tonight, the fact of the matter is you know, and that makes you morally obliged to enter into resistance. Because as the old formula says, if you're not in resistance, then you're complicit. In extreme moral situations, like hiding Jews in the Second World War, there's that absolute binary choice. You're complicit or you're in resistance. And that's the actuality of the situation. And this is like goes to the heart of what non-violence is about. The modern non-violence theory wasn't created by Gandhi, it was created by Thoreau. And this was Thoreau's point. He was an American guy in the 19th century. What Thoreau said on civil disobedience is that when a government is engaged in injustice, the only place for a moral person is in prison. In other words, through your act of resistance to an immoral government, you will end up in prison. And that was his central point. And Thoreau was the person that influenced Gandhi more than anyone else. And that's the heritage that we're in today. And so this comes back to this fundamental point about why we're in this world and what we should be doing. And throughout history, people that have been successful in resistance have been motivated by duty and honor and self-respect. In other words, following their tradition. And it's those values that create success paradoxically. It's not the desire for success, it's the enactment of your duty to your ancestors and your responsibilities to those that come after you. In other words, this is the main show, right? This is what I want you to think about. It's not like, will it work, won't it work? The first step is, what is my duty in 2021? Okay, so once you've made that decision, the next question is, how do you make that resistance work effectively? And that's a question of social science. It's a question of looking at how people are successful and what is necessary. And the central concept here is a tipping point. When you're engaged in social struggle, when you're engaged in a labour strike, there's a point, and it's a binary point. Before that point, the opponent says no, 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 and suddenly there's a point at which they say yes. And you don't know where it's going to come. You might know approximately, but there's no gradual transfer, right? If you look at a labour strike, people go, the employers always go no, right? And suddenly they'll go yes. Because if they said half yes, then they know they'd be on a winning streak, right? So they have to pretend to be saying no. It's the same with governments. If you look at every civil resistance episode over the last 50 years, you look at dictators, you look at 1989, the governments say, these are terrorists, these are terrible people, that we're not going to negotiate with them. We're having nothing to do with them. We're going to put them in prison. We're going to shoot them. And then suddenly, bang, at 12 o'clock on Saturday morning, they put out a press release saying, we're going to talk. That's how it works. So we need to focus on where that tipping point is, right? So we know broadly where that tipping point is in a modern Western democracy, because unlike a lot of the critiques of XR, the fact of the matter is civil resistance episodes have happened regularly in Western societies. The classic example of this was Martin Luther King's campaigns in the early 1960s. So an example of a tipping point, and one of the ones that I think is closest to our situation, is the Freedom Riders in, I think, 1961, where 500 people went to prison in Mississippi doing hard labor for several months. And when they got to 500, the federal government went into a flip. That was the tipping point when the federal government decided to enact legislation to desegregate coaches going from one state to the other. Now, the point here is obviously is a little bit more complicated than that. There was lots of other factors, but the fundamental point is here is it's the materiality of the sacrifice, right? There were 500 people in prison in a population of 300 million. So that means in the UK, if there's 250 people in prison, 300 people, maybe 500 people in prison, you can be assured, as much as you can be, you will produce legislative change. Legislative change means something like insulating all the houses in the UK, not giving subsidies to fossil fuel companies, producing the electrification of cars within 5 years, right? That's what legislative change looks like. 500 people in prison will produce something along those lines. So that's the sort of thing we're looking at. And if you think this is just like, an ideological thing, consider, right, in the Black Lives Matter protests, right? I study protests and I look at the numbers. When 10,000 people were arrested during the Black Lives Matter protest, that was the tipping point when state governments started saying, we will defund the police and we'll structurally change the law enforcement, right? At 5,000 arrests, they were still calling people terrorists. At 10,000 arrests, that's the tipping point, right? Which is broadly like within the literature of what happens in Western societies. I'll give you another example because it's important for us all to be empowered by this, right? It's not a hopeless situation. There is a number at which Boris Johnson is going to enact legislation. So the other example is the French uprising of 2018, right? 100,000 people were demonstrating for 10 weeks, there were around 10,000 arrests. At Christmas 2018, the French police went to the French state and said, if you don't sort this situation out, and if you don't pay us properly, we're not going to police things after Christmas. You see what I mean? That was the point at which the French state knew it had to enact legislation and pay the police properly. And that's how it works, incidentally. It all works through the police. And it's not that, don't think I'm being naive here, right? It's not like the police suddenly are going to start agreeing with you. It's that they're fed up of doing 5 12-hour shifts, right? That's what makes the police stop, because they're exhausted and they don't think they want to be doing this, or they want more money. That's how it works, okay? So to summarize, right, what we need to be thinking about is material resistance. This is the key concept, right? So going to a bank and smashing loads of windows, for instance, is not material resistance. It's symbolic. It's not going to make the banks change anything, right? What's going to make the government change things is when millions of people can't get to work in the morning, or, you know, fuel supplies stop. It's worthwhile noting, by the way, that if you read Tony Blair's biography, the point of his premierships, when he was most terrified, was the point at which lorry drivers blockaded the ports, the oil depots, right? Why was that? Because he was 5 days away from the government, you know, stopping. That was the point when he was most scared, not when the Tories were doing things, or not in the elections. This is what material resistance looks like. That's point number one. Point number two is the tipping point is around 500 people in prison, right? Around 3,000 arrests. Now, the reason I'm talking about prison is because in a time of COVID, the problem is it's very difficult to do mass civil resistance because of the social distancing. But 500 people enter into resistance is possible with social distancing. So that's what I suggest we need to focus on now during COVID. The third thing is everything has to be focused on one time and place. This is a tragic, like, illiteracy in XR, is loads of people going off, being heroes, doing little actions all over the place, right? It doesn't work. The first principle, right, of military action and all civil resistance is based upon military theory, right? It just is. Get that into, you know, think about that. One of the main books about Gandhi was called War Without Violence, right? We're engaged in a non-violent war against radical evil. That's the situation. And the first principle of military theory is to concentrate your resources in one time and place. Everyone goes to the same place for the obvious reason that you overwhelm the opponent at that point in time or place. And the fourth thing is, taken from Martin Luther King's campaigns, you need a dilemma action. You need something like insulate all the houses in Britain, you know, electrify the cars, whatever it is. In other words, it's something that enables the opponent to save face. They're able to do it. So when Martin Luther King went to Birmingham in the Children's March, his aim, his dilemma action was that every department store in central Birmingham employed at least one black person, right? Symbolic. So it enabled the merchants to make a concession. And that's how they got the victory. Because what Extinction Rebellion needs more than anything else is a victory, right? We need to get a win. We need to know how this shit happens so that then we can replicate it and go to the country and say, guys, this is what you need to do because it works. Okay, so that's really, like, don't let anyone persuade you this is not materially possible. You know, we're not talking about Egypt. No one needs to go to prison and have their fingernails pulled out, right? This is totally possible with the resources we have in Extinction Rebellion and allied movements at this point in February 2021. So I'm going to talk about some of the practicalities of it, or a few aspects of it anyway, and then I'll wind up. So the first thing we need to understand is about prison, right? Prison is not a major material like sacrifice. It's what we're talking about here is people being on remand for between 1 and 4 weeks. We've got loads of empirical evidence that the state does not want to hold you in prison for weeks and months on end, right? The person that was in prison for the longest was me for 6 weeks on the Heathrow thing. So if you only get 6 weeks on Heathrow, you're not going to get more than that for doing anything that's effective civil resistance, okay? And the thing to understand about a British prison, I've been to a British prison like 6 times, so I know something about it. I've been to 5 different prisons, is that when you're on remand, the likelihood of you coming to physical harm is extremely low. The material threat to you is extremely low, right, statistically. And this is primarily because you're on a remand wing, right, which basically means like it's a clearing station in a prison. So there's no gangs, no one knows each other. It's everyone's milling around trying to work out how to get their beans on toast, right? It's not like some sort of, you know, film set, you know what I mean? So that's basically what we're talking about. The main barriers about going to prison are psychological, right? The fear of the unknown, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. Okay. So what I'm saying here, this is my first sort of, you know, challenge to you. And I haven't really said this to XR people, but I'm going to tell you, right? In 2021, you don't have a choice, right? You don't have a choice. You have to enter resistance and you have to go to prison. That's what you have to do, right? Unless you're looking after very young children, or you're looking after the old, or you're traumatized, or you're claustrophobic, or you've got mental health problems. Any of those things, right, you shouldn't be going to prison. You don't need to. But to say you won't go to prison because it's going to affect your job, or because it's going to affect your relationship, or because it's going to affect your housing, those are not morally legitimate reasons at this point in the history of the human race, right? In the same way as in the Second World War, taking Jews in was not like an option, right? You had to do it, otherwise you were complicit. And it's the same situation today. And the thing which is really like excruciatingly frustrating and sort of exciting, right, is that the tipping point of 500 arrests is not that far away. In other words, we probably have already 100 people prepared to enter into resistance to the point of going to prison. And there's something in the literature called jumping the chasm. And what this means is, once you get to a tipping point of a certain number of people engaging in a social activity, then it takes off. So I estimate that is around 500 people. If 500 people all go to prison for 3 or 4 weeks at the same time, I can more or less guarantee, as a social scientist, it will become socially acceptable for radicals to do it, in the same way as at the beginning of Extinction Rebellion, loads of people said, oh, you know, maybe some of you can remember this. People said, oh, you know, getting arrested, I could never get arrested, you know, it's a really weird and wonderful thing, sort of thing. And then April happened, and then loads of people were going, oh yeah, it's okay, you know, getting arrested is just another thing, right? And what I'm here to say to you tonight is going to prison is just another thing, right? You know, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people went to prison on Martin Luther King campaigns. It became another thing, which isn't to say that it wasn't difficult, but it wasn't, you know, beyond whatever. It's a thing which people can do. And it happens to have a tipping point of 500, which is a lot lower than the 5,000 arrests we need, or whatever it is. And the beauty of what we're going to be proposing to you is you don't have to make a commitment not knowing who else is going to join you, right? So if Dolly there, hello Dolly, you've got me if Dolly stands up and says, I'm going to prison, right? You know, a lot of you are going to go, right, you know, well, I'm not going to go if it's just Dolly, because that's not going to get us very far, because Roger Hallam says if 2 people go to prison, it's a waste of time, right? So what we're wanting you to do tonight is to make a conditional commitment. Now, conditional commitment is this amazing social technology, which basically means I will do it if a critical mass of others do it. So there's no point me ringing you up in 3 months' time going, well, you know, Dolly, we've got 30 people, but we need 120, you're not obligated to do it. You're only obligated to do it if you get the 120, which will make it actually work. We're better to keep our powder dry until we've got to the critical mass. So, you know, I helped create the first rent strike in London. It's one of my claims to fame. And the way we did it was through conditional commitment. You don't knock on a tenant's door and go, hey, do you want to go on strike? Because they're going to rent strike, because they're going to get evicted, right? Who wants to do that? Well, if you say to people, if 500 of you go on strike, would you go on strike as well? Then they all go, yeah, you know, because I'm being screwed by the landlord. You see how it works? So then you get to the 500 conditional commitments and you ring everyone up and go, it's okay, you can do it now because 500 people are doing it, right? And that was the first rent strike in 30 years in London, right? Got first time it got a rent reduction. So that's the methodology we're using here. So you don't need to worry that it's just going to be you and Dolly or whatever, right? It's okay. It's going to be like a critical mass of you. And yes, you'll have to like sign your commitment in blood. I think Indigo's got a supply of something, but like the trade unionists used to do in the 19th century. So yes, something along those lines. All right. So the last thing to say is about the process. So I've been in the business of trying to get people to enter into resistance to the point of prison. Have you noticed the framing there, by the way, right? For about 2 years. So what I know is for most of you, you know, many of you probably are prepared to go to prison, but what you're thinking is I don't want to do this without support, which is absolutely right. You need to know the practicalities, you know, what happens, because it's all about fear. And the way you deal with fear is through knowing exactly what's going to happen. You know, what happens when you go through the doors? Okay, you sign a form, you have to change some clothes, you go to the doctor, you're in a cell with 2 people, they let you out 3 times a day. You know, you get mainly carbohydrates. It takes a week to get a vegan diet. Usually you get your books after 3 days. You can make 5 phone calls a week. You need to make sure there's 50 quid on your account, right? You need to know all that crap, right? Because if you know it, then, you know, at least you know what's going on. So what's going to happen is after this call, you will proceed, as it were, along a process whereby you'll be told about a specific project and you'll go on a database so that you can, you know, have choice of a number of projects potentially, and then you'll go to a workshop where someone like Cathy or someone who's been to prison several times will go through the practical elements of what it means to be in a room for 2 weeks. Okay, so that's it. I'm just going to conclude really with a quote, but just as an introduction to the quote, I say this to people a lot, which is by definition, all of you on this call are caring people, right? You're the sort of people that when the shit hits the fan, you're going to be on the street. And the problem is the central agony of the climate catastrophe is it's not in the home counties yet, right? If there were dead bodies in the home counties, I wouldn't have to be on this call to you, right? You'd already be down in London in prison. The problem is the dead bodies are in Malawi, right? You know, think about that. And so the tragedy is people won't potentially step up because it's not in their face yet. But when it's in their face, it's going to be far too late. That's the absolute tragedy of our existential situation. So what's required is for you to do this now, not to do it in 5 years when there's dead bodies in the home counties, right? Because you're going to be doing this anyway, sooner or later, right? So you might as well do it now, because that's when it's going to have the social effect, rather than, you know, doing it because of your disgust 5, 10 years down the line. And the second thing is, in conclusion, is to reiterate this point, right? Which sounds terrible, and I feel terrible saying it, but it's true. You're complicit, right? To the extent you don't enter into resistance, unless you want to, in one of those groups I mentioned, you're complicit in this evil to the extent that you don't enter into resistance. And to support me on this, I'm going to do my final quote, which is by Einstein, right? Who was a decent guy, as you know. So this is the quote, which a friend of mine's got on his email. So I always read it. So it goes, those who have privilege to know have the duty to act. So that's us, guys, 2021. Thank you.